On January 3rd, 2026, with the first light of morning, the world awoke to a new reality. U.S. President Donald Trump announced that a large-scale operation had been carried out against Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro, and that Maduro had been removed from the country. In the same statement, it was said that Venezuela's oil infrastructure had temporarily come under U.S. control. So what was the real reason? The war on drugs, democracy, or something else the world is afraid to talk about? When the sound of F-35 engines rose over Venezuela, what was heard was not merely a fighter jet. It was the final scream of a dying currency, the U.S. dollar. That night, Venezuela's capital sank into darkness. The power grid was disabled by a cyber attack. 150 warplanes took up coordinated positions over the city. Delta Force commandos silently infiltrated the Fort Tiuna military base. The target was clear: Nicolás Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores. The operation's codename, Absolute Resolve. At ORA 247, it was over. Maduro was taken from his bed in his pajamas. He and his wife were put onto a helicopter and transferred to the USS Iwo Jima, positioned in the Caribbean Sea. A country's leader had been abducted from his own homeland under cover of night. When morning came, the global media told only one story. The reason for the operation was America's fight against drugs. Narcoterrorism was being ended. Democracy was being spread. But there's a truth they did not tell you on the news. This was not a democracy or national security operation. This was a desperate attempt to keep the dollar in your pocket from losing its value, a forced effort to keep it alive. And no one was going to tell you that. So I will. Because this story does not begin with drugs. It begins with oil rigs, bank vaults, and a collapsing empire. America's problem with Venezuela is not new, but Venezuela's move that could kill America is. While the Venezuelan regime was conducting a behind-the-scenes exploratory process with the Trump administration, it was simultaneously deepening its ties with China and Russia. Venezuela's national oil company, PDVSA, was organizing operations to reclaim ships seized by the U.S. Navy and was refusing to accept Washington's authority over its oil revenues. In October 2025, Venezuela signed an agreement with the People's Republic of China. The terms were clear: oil sales would no longer be conducted in U.S. dollars, but in China's currency, the yuan. The system is simple. If oil is not sold in dollars, global demand for the dollar disappears. If the dollar disappears, America's $36 trillion debt empire collapses. The invasion of Venezuela was the last bullet fired to save the dollar. And here is the key point you must understand. America's global power does not come from F-35s, aircraft carriers, or nuclear weapons. The real power comes from the petrodollar system. Remember the 1974 agreement with Saudi Arabia. The United States provided military protection. The Saudis agreed to sell oil exclusively in dollars. This deal forced the entire world to trade in dollars. If you wanted oil, you needed dollars. Demand for the dollar stayed permanently high. America could borrow endlessly. The Federal Reserve printed money, the world paid the bill, but the system began to crack. In 2023, Saudi Arabia began selling oil in yuan. In 2024, Russia and Iran switched to their own currencies. In 2025, Venezuela joined them. And suddenly, America's $36 trillion debt burden became unsustainable because no one wanted dollars anymore. The U.S. called on banks to seize Venezuela's oil revenues. Does that sound familiar? This is a classic imperial plunder operation. The moment the U.S. saw the possibility of oil being sold in a currency other than the dollar, it deployed military force, just as it did in Guatemala, Panama, and Iraq. For all these reasons, the operation was carried out on the morning of January 3rd, 2026. Venezuela holds 303 billion barrels of oil, the largest proven reserves in the world, even more than Saudi Arabia's. And those reserves were now flowing to China in exchange for yuan. America could not allow that. It never would. Because if the Venezuelan model spread, if other oil-producing countries followed suit, the petrodollar system would collapse. If the system collapses, the dollar collapses. If the dollar collapses, America loses the ability to service its debts. Game over. So what did America do? What it has always done. It used military force. But this time there was something different. This operation was not hidden. It was not a secret coup. On the contrary, it was a message displayed to the entire world. The message was clear: anyone who threatens the petrodollar system will share the same fate. Now let's look at the details of this operation, because what you are seeing here is not just a military maneuver. This is a financial execution. The operation unfolded in 3 phases. Phase 1, cyber attack. Venezuela's power grid had been mapped by the NSA for years. Critical nodes were identified. At 0130, the grid was remotely shut down. The entire country was plunged into darkness. Communications were cut. Air defense systems became inoperable. Phase 2, air superiority. F-35s arrived invisibly. Radar systems had already collapsed. Strategic targets were struck within minutes. Military airfields, command centers, air defense batteries. The Venezuelan Air Force was destroyed before it could even take off. Phase 3. The abduction. Delta Force teams landed by helicopter at the Fort Tiuna base. Maduro's location was already known. Intelligence work had been ongoing for months. Collaborators inside the base opened the gates. Guards were neutralized before they could even raise their weapons. Maduro and his wife were captured. At 03:15, the helicopters lifted off, heading toward the USS Iwo Jima waiting in the Caribbean Sea. At 04 WOARC, Maduro was on a ship under U.S. military custody. The operation was complete. At 08 GAR that morning, a statement came from the White House. The president said, "This operation is part of the war against narcoterrorism. The Maduro regime has funded itself for decades through drug trafficking. It has poisoned American citizens and destabilized the region. Tonight, we delivered justice. Then came the critical sentence. We will temporarily operate Venezuela's oil infrastructure. Production will continue until the country stabilizes. The revenues will be used for the welfare of the Venezuelan people. This is not democracy. This is a bank robbery. To operate Venezuela ex-oil infrastructure means to control the money generated by the sale of that oil. And that money will no longer be in yuan. It will be in dollars, because if America operates it, America sets the rules. 303 billion barrels of oil. At $80 per barrel, that is a $24 trillion asset. America's total debt is $36 trillion. Venezuela alone could cover 2/3 of that debt. But this is not just about money. It's about control. It's about keeping the system alive. Now let me give you a history lesson, because this story has happened before under the same pretexts, with the same lies. December 20th, 1989, Panama. Manuel Noriega, a leader once created and supported by the United States. He had worked with the CIA. He knew about the drug trade, because America knew as well. But one day, Noriega made the wrong move. He demanded control of the Panama Canal. He went against American interests. What happened? Operation Just Cause. 27,000 U.S. troops invaded Panama. Noriega was abducted. The charge, narcoterrorism. The real reason, control of the canal. What is happening in Venezuela today is an exact copy of that. The same excuse, the same method, the same outcome. History does not repeat itself, but it rhymes. Let's give one more example. 1956, the Suez Crisis. Britain and France responded with military force when Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal. They cited regional stability as the reason. The real reason was economic control over the canal. What happened? The United States intervened. Britain and France were forced to withdraw, because at that moment, global hegemony was shifting from Britain to America. The Suez Crisis marked the beginning of the end of the British Empire. Now, what is happening in Venezuela in 2026 could mean the same thing for America, because the world is no longer unipolar like it was in 1989. There's China, there's Russia, there's BRICS, and they are watching. Within hours of the operation, reactions began to pour in. Russia's Ministry of Foreign Affairs issued a harsh statement. This is a clear violation of sovereignty, an act of aggression that disregards international law. They said they condemned it. China's foreign ministry used more diplomatic but equally firm language. Interference in Venezuela's internal affairs is unacceptable. The country's territorial integrity must be preserved. But the most significant response came at the military level. Russian-made S-400 air defense systems were deployed near the Colombian border. China announced that the oil agreement it had signed with Venezuela was still valid, and that it would recognize the revenues of the interim government it acknowledged. Oil markets went wild. Brent crude prices jumped 20% overnight, rising from $75 per barrel to $90. The next day, they hit $95. Because the markets understood one thing, Venezuelan oil was no longer part of the free market. It was under American control. Is there a supply shortage? No. Venezuelan oil is still being produced, but no one is sure where that oil is going anymore. Uncertainty drives prices up. Fear drives prices up. And while you're wondering why gasoline prices are rising as you watch this news, they are calculating how to postpone their debt crisis using Venezuela's seized 303 billion barrels of oil. So will this operation succeed? Can America save the dollar? No, because this operation does not save the dollar. It accelerates its death. Think about it. Saudi Arabia is watching. The United Arab Emirates is watching. Kuwait is watching. Qatar is watching. And they are all asking the same question. If we switch to the yuan, will America do the same to us? The answer is yes, but it can't anymore. Because the world has changed. When the United States invaded Panama in 1989, no one objected. The Soviet Union had collapsed. There was no rival. When it invaded Iraq in 2003, again, there was little more than a few protests and condemnations. The outcome didn't change. But in 2026, the situation is different. China is now the world's second largest economy. Russia is an energy superpower. BRICS countries account for 35% of global GDP, and all of them want to move away from the petrodollar system. The invasion of Venezuela gave them their greatest justification. Now they can say, look at what America is doing. It is invading countries to protect its dollar. So let's build our own monetary system. And they will. BRICS countries have been talking for years about a common currency, a gold-backed system, a structure that would break the dollar's monopoly. The Venezuela crisis will accelerate this plan, because now there's urgency. Now the threat is concrete. So what does this mean for you? Gasoline prices will rise, inflation will increase, the dollar will lose value, gold prices will climb. Alternative assets like Bitcoin will surge, because people will flee the dollar. They will look for safe havens. America invaded Venezuela to prevent this, but it poured gasoline on the fire to put it out. Now let me tell you another truth. This operation is not just about Venezuela. It is a show of force, a warning. It is telling the world, try to leave the petrodollar system and you will pay the price. But this threat no longer works. Because after the invasion of Venezuela, Saudi Arabia quietly signed a new agreement with China. Iran increased oil production. Russia began selling to India in rupees. Every threat reduces trust in the system. Every military operation pushes the rest of the world further away. There is something America does not understand. It is no longer the sole superpower. It can no longer do whatever it wants, because the world has become multipolar. And the Venezuela operation showed this reality to everyone. So what happens in the end? Venezuelan oil has fallen into American hands. Maduro is a prisoner. The operation appears successful. But in the long run, this is the American empire's Suez crisis. Britain won militarily at Suez in 1956, but lost strategically. The world realized Britain was no longer the hegemon. Power shifted to America. Now in 2026, America has won militarily in Venezuela, but is losing strategically. The world is realizing that America is no longer the absolute hegemon. Power is shifting east. Let me end with this. Empires always collapse in the same way. First, their monetary systems break down, then military interventions increase, then allies drift away. Finally, collapse comes. That is how Rome fell. That is how the Ottoman Empire fell. That is how the British Empire fell. And now America is on the same path. When tanks rolled into Caracas on the morning of January 3rd, 2026, they didn't just occupy a city, they drove the final nail into the coffin of the dollar. Be prepared. Now I ask you, if this is what was done to Venezuela, would you be surprised if the same thing happened to Saudi Arabia tomorrow? Or if every country that sells in a currency other than the dollar lined up one by one? Do you think the world is really moving toward a multipolar order? Or is this just the calm before the storm? Write this in the comments. Is the petrodollar ending? And say what you truly think. Because this time, you are not just a viewer, you are a witness to history. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe, because this story is only just beginning and you'll be following every step of it right here.